All right, good evening. It's 7 o'clock, so we're going to get started. I'm excited about our presentation tonight, and I'm sure many of you are as well. I'll get started by saying thank you for everyone that's joined us here tonight, and a big thanks to Ben for being here to tell us some really fascinating and interesting information tonight. I'll start out saying my name is Chris Fox. I am the Land Stewardship Director here at Sycamore Land Trust. And I know we've got a lot of familiar faces out there and some new folks, so welcome. You can keep your video on if you'd like. We want this to be semi-informal, so it can be kind of a conversation. But we would ask that you keep muted for the time being until we get to the question and answer section. Tonight, as you probably are well aware, we were having a conversation with Ben Goldfarb, author of Eager: The Surprising and Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. If you haven't read the book, I think by the end of this, you're going to want to go get yourself a copy. I ran into this book a year or so ago looking for other books, and I thought, I've always been curious and fascinated by beavers. I thought I'd give it a try, and I was blown away by the book. Ben's a fantastic writer, and it was full of great information. And, not just because Ben's here, but it is one of my favorite books of all time. And I learned so much about beavers, and we have beavers on Sycamore properties. And so it's been very helpful for me as a land steward to learn more about kind of the history and how they impact the land. So hopefully tonight you'll learn some things you didn't know and develop some curiosity. This is being recorded, so if you want to look back at it or share with your friends and family, this is a great opportunity to do that. If you enjoyed tonight, you might want to pay attention to our next coming. This is part of a series, our conservation conversations, and our next one will be in May, May 12th to be exact. We have a local expert, Nathan Ingebright, who is works for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. He's a state herpetologist, and he's going to be talking about the amphibians and reptiles of the Bean Blossom Creek Valley. Nate has been doing some surveys for us on some of our properties in the Bean Blossom Creek watershed, and he's been looking at different species of reptiles and amphibians. And during this survey, we found a new population of the state endangered Kirtland snake, which was really exciting. There's not a lot known about this snake. We have it on another property, but we didn't know about it on this particular property, which was exciting for the DNR as well as for us. So we'll talk about that and some of the other results of that study. We're continuing that study this year. And we also started another study at our preserve near Columbus, Touch the Earth. And the picture there is a spotted salamander that we just found last week, which is not necessarily a rare species. It's not commonly seen because it stays underground often, but it could be a new county record for that preserve. So there's some exciting things happening, and tune in on May 12th, hear from Nate and learn a little bit more about that. So this series will go on throughout the year, so stay tuned to learn more about what we have planned next. For those of you that are new here tonight that might not know about Sycamore, we're doing a brief introduction to Sycamore before we turn it over to Ben. Our mission is to preserve the beauty, health, and diversity of Southern Indiana natural landscapes through strategic land conservation and acquisitions and environmental education. We protect over 10,000 acres on about 120 different properties spread throughout 26 counties in the southern, kind of southwestern part of the state. We don't have properties in every county in that region, but we do work with landowners throughout that area of the state. We were founded in 1990, so we're a little over 30 years old. We are accredited by the Land Trust Alliance. Not all our properties have trails, but we do have over 30 miles of trails. So if you're interested in hiking, there's plenty of opportunities to do that throughout our preserves. We also have one of the longest boardwalks in the Midwest, which I'm intimately familiar with. And we have free environmental educational programs for adults and youth, and nearly 1,300 members and growing. And we rely on hundreds of volunteers to help us do the work we do. And if you're interested in volunteering, reach out to us because we have plenty of opportunities. And before I turn it over to Ben, just talk about one of our key properties, the Bean Blossom Bottoms Nature Preserve, which is where our boardwalk is located. This property is probably what we consider our keystone property. It is a state dedicated nature preserve. It's been recognized as an important bird area, a wetland of distinction. So it has a lot of recognition for the quality of habitat it provides. It's over 735 acres now, and it's part of our Bean Blossom Creek Bicentennial Conservation Area, target area, which is over 1,600 acres of land we preserve in the Bean Blossom Creek watershed. And this property has been restored through a variety of both active and passive stewardship activities. And this habitat has provided, important places for many protected, threatened and rare and endangered species to live and find a refuge. Everything from, orchids to the state endangered American bittern. It's been a fantastic property, and in fact, we're going to be doing a bio blitz there this year to just find out how many things are using this property, and things, we'll probably find things that we didn't even know were there. And one of the things that's not necessarily rare or threatened anymore that live there is the beaver, which you're going to hear a lot about. But it's been exciting to see them there. They have been a big part of the restoration. And even in the short time I've been with Sycamore, I've seen the changes that have happened there, all thanks to the hard work of the beaver. We've installed cameras this year throughout a couple properties, trail cameras, and we've really got to witness firsthand the fact that the word busy beaver has a real meaning behind it, because they stay very busy and do a lot of great restoration work for us 24 hours. And we got really lucky this year in that we had a camera up in a place that we did not expect to see beavers. It was just a field where we saw a lot of activity from deer and coyotes, and we're just a game trail basically. And then one day we came out there and there was a pond, and we got lucky to watch a family of beavers move in and start to build a new pond in order to get into some feeding areas. And it's been really great process for us to see on a new property, see the beavers moving in. This is one we just started protecting and have 80 acres of wetland restoration planned in the near future, and the beavers are getting a head start on us. And from this, our very talented land stewardship assistant, Ellen Bergen, is also a very talented artist, has done an artist rendering of kind of this whole process from start to finish, the beavers moving in there. And this is just a sample of the artwork Ellen has produced. And if you'd like to see more of this, this will be in our upcoming twig. And you can get a twig, which is our newsletter. They come out a couple times a year, and members are able to read about what's going on with Sycamore, see about current events, and hear about conservation, education, and members are how we're able to do what we do. So consider that if you're not a member. And if you are, you have this to look forward to, the artwork that Ellen created that tells the story of what we witnessed this year. Ellen is also going to be helping tonight do the question and answers at the end. And if you have a question during the presentation, just enter it in the chat, and Ellen will then have that at the end and forward that to Ben. So if you have any questions, send it to Ellen, and they will get that to Ben at the end. And also with us tonight, I want to give a shout out to Kate Hamill, who is here with us doing the technical support behind the scenes. She's also the one that helps put together the twig and does all of our posting. So if you ever had questions you see there, Kate is the one that probably is one that can answer that for you, or is the one that's responsible for getting it out there to you. So our office is in Bloomington at Cedar Crest, and there's some of the information if you want to find out more about us. And let's move on. Let's get on to the book. And Ben is an environmental journalist and an award-winning author. His works have appeared in The Atlantic, Science, Orion Magazine, and The Washington Post. He lives with his wife, Elise, and his dog, Kit, which of course is named after a baby beaver. And Ben, it's a great honor and pleasure to have you here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for that warm introduction. And it's really wonderful to see what Beavers have been up to at Bean Blossom. Great to see Ellen's art too. That's really beautiful and probably tells the story better than my writing does. As I was saying to Chris earlier, I feel like at this point I've evangelized about beavers to just about every state in the country, but never Indiana. So I'm actually excited to learn from you guys during the Q&A. Maybe you can tell me what your beavers have been up to locally. I'd be really curious about what the Hoosier Beavers are up to. So tonight I'll be talking a lot about beaver-based restoration, working with or partnering with these animals to restore ecosystems, as Sycamore is seeing at their own properties. But before I get into sort of how we can work with beavers or even use beavers, I think it's important to establish a few basic facts about what beavers are and what they do. So beavers, of course, are rodents, right? They're North America's largest rodent. Typical adult beaver is 40 to 50 pounds. So I think they're bigger than most people realize. They're semi-aquatic rodents, right? So they spend all of their lives in and around water, and they're incredibly well adapted for this unique semi-aquatic niche they fill. They've got one of the densest pelts in the animal kingdom, which of course was their downfall, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But they stay nice and toasty. They've got webbed duck-like hind feet. Very powerful, agile swimmers. They can stay underwater for up to 15 minutes, so they're really good breath holders. They've got a second set of transparent eyelids that act as goggles, as well as a second set of lips, kind of like a valve that can close behind their front teeth, so they can chew and drag branches underwater and not drown. I think that's really cool. And then, of course, what's a beaver's most iconic feature? What makes a beaver a beaver? The tail, right? The tail is sort of this Swiss Army knife. It's a rudder while they swim. It's a kickstand out on land. It's a fat storage device. Beavers actually put on fat for the winter in their tails. And it's an alarm system, right? If you spend a lot of time in and around wetlands, you've probably heard the smack of a beaver's tail hitting the water, and they do that to warn other beavers about the presence of predators. And the other cool beaver feature is their teeth, right? You can see that beavers' top and bottom incisors, they're kind of self-sharpening. They make these nice chisel-like points, and their teeth are orange because they're chemically and structurally fortified with iron that beavers derive from their foods. They've got very, very durable, powerful teeth, which obviously is important when you spend your whole life cutting down trees, right? Beavers cut down trees to eat the cambium, that's the inner layer of bark. They're what scientists call choosy generalists. They've got a few tree species they really like. Anything in the poplar family, willows are a good beaver species. But let's take just about any deciduous tree. They do tend to avoid conifers, and they eat lots of green herbaceous stuff as well, like water lilies and cattails and wildflowers and all kinds of stuff. They are totally herbivorous. So, of course, in addition to cutting down trees to eat the cambium, the inner bark, they also use the wood as construction material, right? And there are two basic types of beaver structures. The first is the beaver lodge. That's kind of the beaver housing unit. Chris had a really great picture of a giant lodge, snow-covered lodge. That was cool to see. And inside the lodge, you've got a little elevated nesting chamber, and in there, you've got 2 to as many as 8 or so beavers. That's the mother and father, the monogamous mating pair, and then 3 year classes of offsprings, the baby beavers, the kits, the 1-year-olds and the 2-year-olds, all kind of cohabitating together. And then those 2-year-olds will go, disperse out looking for their own territories, like teenagers heading off to college or something. And then the other beaver feature that I'm sure a lot of you've seen is the beaver dam. So why do beavers build dams? Why go to all the trouble of making these walls out of sticks and rocks and mud? What's the point of this unique specialized behavior? Well, a beaver on land, as one biologist put it to me, is basically a fat, slow, smelly package of meat, right? Beavers get eaten by black bears, coyotes, out here where I live, we've got lots of cougars, wolves love beavers. So, any beaver on land is going to be pretty vulnerable. So by building that dam and spreading out water and deepening that pond, they're just expanding the extent of their own habitat and shelter. So they can swim up to that good-looking aspen tree, cut it down, float it back to the lodge, and not have to go out on land. And I should add, of course, not all beavers build dams, right? If there's, if they're already living in a big lake or a river that has plenty of water depth and they feel secure, they'll just very happily tunnel into the banks and live there pretty inconspicuously. But in these smaller streams and wetlands, that's when you tend to see the dam building behavior. And here's the remains of a beaver that got eaten by a wolf in Minnesota. This is in Voyageurs National Park. And wolves actually eat the entire beaver, pelt bones and all. They just leave the mandible and the lower incisors. So you don't want to be a beaver out on land. So beavers, a typical beaver colony, when they're building dams, they're usually building one big primary dam and then a number of smaller secondary dams. Sometimes you see as many as 10 or 15 dams at a single site. And these dams come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. Here's a nice little one that's probably feet long and 1 foot high. And here's a really nice primary dam, also in northern Minnesota, that's probably 15 feet tall and 800 feet wide, and is obviously the work of many generations of beavers, adding their stick to the pile. So this sort of massive construction is not typical, but it is a kind of a cool example of what they're capable of when left to their own devices. And of course, these big beaver dams can impound giant volumes of water, right? I'm always impressed by their hydrological savvy. I often think that if you took an engineer from the Army Corps and put him on a stream and said, okay, build a dam that minimizes labor and maximizes the total impoundment, right? They would put the dam at the exact same place that the beavers do. And here's a really nice illustration. This is this is a pond formed by a single beaver dam that's probably 300 acres. They just stuck it at the little narrow constriction, the little pinch point in the stream, and flooded this giant valley with a single dam, which I think is pretty incredible. And the other important beaver feature that we don't always talk about is their canal digging. They're not just great builders, they're great diggers as well. And these canal networks can extend hundreds of feet up into the forest. And again, they're swimming up that canal, cutting down a tree, maybe sectioning it up and then floating those pieces back down the canal, all without leaving the water. And this is a really important way that beavers kind of spread water out on the landscape. You often see, tadpoles and juvenile fish in here. So these, we don't talk about canals as being important beaver habitat features, but they really are. So, you put it all together and here's what it looks like. So I live in Colorado. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. And this is a nice beaver complex. This is about 12,000 feet up in the Rocky Mountains. So they really get way the heck up there. And you can just see that, they're capturing enormous volumes of water, right? The stream just comes kind of meandering through the valley, and then it hits all of these linear features here, these beaver dams. And these beavers are capturing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of gallons of water and just saturating that valley bottom and creating this spectacular wetland complex where none would have been. So beavers, of course, they're building dams and creating ponds and digging canals to enhance their own habitat, but in the process, they're enhancing habitat for lots of other creatures as well, right? Beavers are what scientists call a keystone species, an animal that's supporting a lot of weight in an ecosystem, right? We know that water is life and that wetlands are where you tend to find a lot of life. And it's almost impossible to name a species that doesn't benefit from beavers at some point in its life cycle. But a few classic beneficiaries. We know that wading birds, waterfowl, even songbirds, passerines, all birds do really well in and around beaver complexes. Eating the tadpoles and the fish and the aquatic insects emerging from the pond. Here's a really nice great blue heron rookery at a beaver complex in Wisconsin. And, there are a million studies showing that wood ducks and mergansers and golden eyes all do great in the presence of beavers. That other semi-aquatic mammals, mink, muskrat, otters, moose, love having beavers around. Here's a moose chilling in a beaver pond in Utah. Of course, lots of amphibians. Right, here's a boreal toad, which is a species we have here in Colorado that's almost a beaver pond obligate breeder. You find it pretty much only in beaver ponds, but lots of studies connecting wood frogs and leopard frogs, species that you have in Indiana with beaver ponds as well. Here's kind of a cool example of beaver created habitat. So this is a beaver complex in Minnesota. You can sort of see, here's the beaver dam, right? So in this case, the beavers left the area or they died. The dam broke, this giant pond drained. So this is creating, really good kind of a lush wet meadow for, moose and deer, really good habitat. But in this case, the beaver lodge was left high and dry after the pond drained. And in this instance, a pack of wolves actually moved into this lodge and raised their pups in the lodge. So that's beavers creating habitat for their direct predators. I think that's pretty amazing. And then the other, really important beaver beneficiary, especially from a management standpoint, are fish, right? Especially, salmon, trout, and salmon. I used to live in Washington, and there, I mean, that was, Washington is probably the beaver capital of the country at this point, because they create such good habitat for juvenile salmon, right? If you're a baby fish, you don't want to live in the fast flowing main stem river. You're just gonna get blown downstream, right? You want to live in the side channels and the eddies and the pools and the meanders, right? You want that complex, slow water refuge habitat, and that's exactly what beavers create. And of course, in the Midwest, your native salmonid is the brook trout, and there's a really nice brook trout that I hauled out of a beaver in Wyoming, actually. And I've heard from a million anglers that they've caught the biggest fish in their life in beaver ponds. So there's a great beaver fish connection. Of course, one objection that you hear from time to time from fish biologists and anglers is, wait a second, right? We're trying to take dams out of streams right now. We're not trying to put more dams into streams. We're just going to block fish movement. Isn't that bad? But of course, a beaver dam is nothing like a human-built dam, right? Fish jump over beaver dams. They can swim around them during high flow. They can wriggle through the structure. Here's just one nice picture that illustrates the point, right? This is a beaver dam outside of Seattle. Here's the dam. Here's the upstream pond. And here are the two freshly excavated salmon nests. At least two fish had no problem whatsoever getting over that beaver dam. And in fact, the evolutionary connection between beavers and fish is so deep, so intimate, right? They've been co-evolving for millions of years that it inspired my favorite bumper sticker, which is that beavers taught salmon to jump. I think that gets at the connection pretty nicely. So, we don't know exactly how many beavers live in North America today. As Chris said, they're certainly not an endangered species. There are probably 10 to 15 million of them, right? So they're not going to go extinct anytime soon. But I think it's important to remember that they exist today at a tiny fraction of their historic abundance, right? We don't know exactly how many beavers live in North America. Best guess is that there are as many as 400 million beavers on this continent when Europeans arrived. They might have built a couple 100 million beaver ponds. And a little bit of, back of the envelope math tells you that, maybe they impounded 230,000 square miles, which, for reference is about the size of Nevada and Arizona put together. So just a huge amount of this continent was underwater thanks to beavers. And there's no question it was once a much greener, bluer, wetter, lusher place. And, I think that one important thing to remember is that the notion that beavers are keystone species and important animals is something that is not unique to Western science, right? It's important. It's something that native people have understood for many, many thousands of years. There were tribes in the American West, like the Blackfeet, that sanctified beavers, that actually had cultural prohibitions against killing beavers because they understood that beavers were creating these ecological oases on otherwise arid landscapes. So again, this notion that the beavers change the landscape in really beneficial ways is something that Western science is just sort of catching up to, but native people have known for a very, very long time. So a lot of what I tried to do working on this book is just figure out what this continent might have looked like with its full complement of beavers. How would the landscape have functioned? And when you read old trappers' journals and explorers' diaries and railroad survey reports and Native American histories, it's just remarkable, right? There are accounts of explorers, crossing the Midwest and not finding a place to camp for 100 miles because beavers had so thoroughly ponded everything up. Here's a nice observation from Meriwether Lewis, of course, of Lewis and Clark fame, who, in the Missouri Basin in Montana, observed seeing beaver dams in every single tributary of the Missouri River, as far as the eye could see, up to the mountains. And he's, writing this sort of thing every single day in his diary. And in some places the Corps of Discovery couldn't even use those valley bottoms. They had to walk along the ridge lines because beavers had kind of so thoroughly ponded everything up. So that was in 1805, that Lewis and Clark saw beaver dams everywhere. And in 1843, just 38 years later, John James Audubon, of course, the naturalist and painter, traveled the exact same route up the Missouri in Montana. He's looking for a beaver to paint. And he couldn't find a single beaver in the entire Missouri Basin just 4 decades after they had been ubiquitous. So what happened to beavers in just 38 years? What did they turn into? Where did they go? Well, of course, they turned into hats, right? I think that, people hear the phrase beaver hat and they think of like a big fluffy Davy Crockett type of thing. But in fact, beaver hats were these, elegant Victorian style top hats that were all the rage back in Europe. And, beavers, along with timber source that the colonists found in the quote unquote New World. It's really hard to overstate the extent to which, this rapacious desire for beaver pelts was just integral to early American history. Here's the city seal of New York City, where I'm from, where I grew up. And here are the two beavers in the city seal of New York, even today. Kind of an amazing testament to how important they were to the economy. Here's the seal, or the official coin of the Oregon Territory, which covered basically the entire Northwest. And the value of one beaver coin was fixed to the value of one beaver pelt, right? So the entire economy of the Western US operated on the pelt standard. I think that's pretty amazing. Practically every historical event prior to the Civil War has some kind of beaver connection. It was the British denying the American colonists access to trapping grounds west of the Appalachians. That was one of the offenses that pissed off the colonists and kind of spurred the Revolutionary War. The Louisiana Purchase was partly fueled by Jefferson's desire to secure new trapping grounds. And of course, it was those white fur trappers and traders who spread smallpox and other diseases that so ravaged many native tribes. The story of the beaver trade is really the story of early American history and all of its kind of tragedy and grandiosity. Of course, in addition to being a hugely significant historical event, fur trade was this profoundly catastrophic ecological event, right? The fur trade, really begins in New England in the early 1600s and spreads west across the continent. And, by the 1840s or so, beavers are functionally extinct in pretty much all of the lower 48. They're basically gone. So what happens when you kill 400 million beavers? Well, all of those beaver dams break down and all of those lush, rich ponds and wetlands drain. One of the kind of the ironies of the beaver trade is that, it was that beaver trapping that really made agriculture possible in a lot of places, especially in New England, which is pretty, infertile and rocky otherwise. Kill a beaver, the beaver pond drains, and you're left with this beautiful, fertile, treeless, rockless pond bottom that's basically the most arable land. So in some ways, the trapping of beavers actually made agriculture possible in a lot of places in the United States. Of course, if beaver trapping was beneficial to farmers, it was obviously a disaster for most other species. When you've got a healthy beaver-rich stream, all of those beaver dams are acting like speed bumps, right? They're slowing water down, they're collecting water, they're spreading water out laterally onto the floodplain. When you lose all those speed bumps, there's nothing checking the velocity of water, and you often get this really dramatic, rapid erosion and incision. So the stream just cuts through its banks and gets, kind of trapped between those banks, and it can't access that floodplain anymore. So those rich wetlands and wet meadows dry up and kind of desiccate. And I think that oftentimes we see this sort of stream, this kind of stream degradation, and we think, oh, that's probably the product of deforestation or mining or cattle grazing or some other impact. But in many cases, this is the outcome of losing beavers. So we're not really accustomed to thinking of the fur trade in the same terms as logging in the Northeast or the busting of the Midwestern prairie or gold mining in California. Right? We don't think about beaver trapping as being one of the real seminal ecological disasters. But there's no question that it was. And one quick indication of this, this is a Coho salmon, which is a species whose juveniles, their fry, are really, really dependent on ponds and wetlands for rearing. And there have been studies basically showing that the loss of beaver ponds and other features like it, led to a 97% loss of Coho salmon rearing habitat. So just absolutely catastrophic for this species, and wood ducks and leopard frogs and moose. No question, this was a huge disaster. So, fortunately, in the early 1900s, we start to wise up a little bit. The beaver population reaches its nadir in kind of the late 19th century. There are, maybe 100,000 beavers left or so. Pretty much all of them up in Canada. Again, they're, functionally extinct in the lower 48. But slowly but surely, all of these states begin to realize that, hey, these are really important animals, and we should probably bring them back. And they start to reintroduce beavers, mostly using Canadian stock. And they put controls on trapping to kind of conserve the few animals that are left. And slowly, beaver populations start to recover a little bit. Incidentally, the most famous beaver reintroduction, you guys have probably heard of this project, but in the 1940s, Idaho, some biologists in Idaho had the bright idea of reintroducing beavers to what is today the Frank Church Wilderness area. First, they tried moving them back there on horseback. Obviously, the beavers and the horses didn't love that idea. But it was 1948. It was just sort of like post-World War II, and they've got all of these surplus parachutes and airplanes on hand. And one of these biologists had the bright idea of actually airdropping some of these beavers into the wilderness. So in 1948, they airdropped 76 beavers. 75 of the beavers survived. One beaver, unfortunately, escaped from the crate in midair and fell to his death. Very sad. But next year, they flew back over the same area, and there were ponds and wetlands, all the places where they'd released beavers. So this was actually a very successful project at the time. Nobody's doing this anymore, but it was kind of state of the art in 1948. So again, throughout the 20th century, we've got beavers kind of recovering, recolonizing, and taking back some of their former habitat. But of course, the problem is that in their absence, we've colonized the exact same habitat, right? Beavers and humans, we like the same places. We like low gradient stream bottoms and broad fertile floodplains. That's where we put our farms and our roads and our railroads, and that's where they like to build our dams. They're their dams. And I'd argue that we're the nuisance species more than they are, but there's no question that when beavers and humans collide, the results can be problematic. Here's a set of railroad tracks in Massachusetts that had just been refurbished, cost like $1 million to rebuild these tracks, and within 2 months of this $1 million project ending, beavers had the whole place underwater. So that's the kind of thing that beavers do. Here's another nice illustration of human beaver conflict. This is a little cabin in New Mexico, and here I like this picture because here you can see the beavers start their dam up here in the upper left-hand corner. They dam up to the base of the cabin, and they incorporate the cabin in their dam, and they keep going on the other side. So you wouldn't want to be that landowner, but you've got to admire the ingenuity of the beaver in that case, right? Probably the most common cause of beaver conflict is damming and road culverts, right? If you're a beaver, the road bed is like the world's greatest dam, and the culvert is the leak in the dam, and beavers plug up leaks, right? That's what they spend their whole lives doing. So the water rises, the road washes out, very expensive to maintain. That's again probably the most common beaver conflict. But they do get into weirder mischief. Here's a beaver that broke into a dollar store in Maryland and was actually browsing the plastic Christmas tree rack when it was apprehended by the authorities, which feels like a metaphor for something. So, the way that these sorts of beaver conflicts are almost always handled is by killing the offending beaver, right? Which makes a lot of sense. The beaver's causing a problem, get the beaver out of there. And every year, the federal government kills about 20,000 beavers. Private nuisance trappers kill, certainly tens and possibly hundreds of thousands more. We don't really know how many. And the problem with that kind of reflexive, lethal approach is twofold. I mean, first, when you're killing the beaver, of course, you're potentially eliminating that great pond and wetland habitat they create. But also, all you're doing is opening a vacancy sign for the next family of beavers, right? As long as this culvert is still there, luring them in, they're always going to come back. And there are just communities all over the country that are engaged in this very expensive and, I would argue, inhumane cycle of trapping and recolonization and trapping and recolonization. So you start to wonder, well, maybe there's there are better ways of doing business. Maybe there's some non-lethal methods we can use to coexist with these animals. So lots of beavers are killed for cutting down trees, right? For cutting down people's ornamental trees or their fruit trees or what have you. Actually, my wife and I got married a few years ago in Detroit on Belle Isle, which is an island in the Detroit River. And I just read the other day that the Belle Isle Conservancy had killed a few of the beavers that were cutting down willow trees on Belle Isle. So I'm like, man, that's where I got married. That feels like a personal affront. So I just don't think that any beaver should ever be killed for cutting down a tree. That's just too easy a problem to solve. So here, a really nice illustration of coexistence. This is a little reservoir here in Colorado that's managed by another land trust, the Central Colorado Conservancy. And what they did, I thought pretty creatively, is that they protect. So they fenced off those cottonwoods and they left unfenced the non-native Siberian elm trees, and the beavers took those down. So that's invasive vegetation management using beavers as your agent. I think that's pretty cool. When the problem is flooding, that's a little bit tougher, but there too, we've got options. This is a contraption known as the Beaver deceiver, part of this broader category of contraptions called flow devices, which, basically the principle is pretty simple. You run the pipe through the beaver dam or into the culvert, and you're just, moving water from the upstream side of the pond to the downstream side, right? You're just creating a leak essentially, and you're draining that pond to a point that both beavers and humans can tolerate. And here's a device that some colleagues and I put in near Spokane, Washington a couple of years ago. And here you can see, right, the pipe just runs through the beaver dam. You can see on these trees the water levels already dropped by 6 to 12 inches after an hour or so. And here we were able to get the water off this woman's property so she could access all of her property again, but there was still enough pond left for the beavers to be happy. And that's kind of a good example of coexistence in action. And generally you want some wire caging so the beavers don't plug up the pipe. Here they tried to do that, and we're not successful ultimately, fortunately. So this is a good example of how easy it can be to solve some of these problems. And again, these devices, when they've been studied, they basically work 87 to 97% of the time. So maybe not every situation. Once in a while, the beavers outsmart them, but there's no question that there are many, many thousands of places all over the country where we're currently trapping beavers to manage conflicts, and we could be using these non-lethal techniques as well. Another option for managing beaver conflicts. I actually don't know the regulations in Indiana. It's very state by state, right? Whether you can live trap and relocate beavers. So I don't know if this is possible in Indiana or not, but certainly, in Washington and Colorado, my kind of two home states, do a lot of this. You just live trapping troublemaking beavers on private property and generally moving them, to public land, to national forest land, where there currently are no beavers. Here's Sandy and Chomper being relocated to their new home in northern Washington. And again, you're trying to live trap and move entire beaver families together, right? So you're not, breaking up families, because otherwise they'll probably die. But this can be a pretty effective way of both managing conflicts and also, repopulating some of these stream systems that historically had beavers and don't anymore. But I would check the regulations in Indiana. Of course, one of the issues with beaver relocation is that when you move a beaver to a new place, right? They don't have their their lodge and dam yet. They don't have that little habitat, that shelter. So they get they often get eaten right away by bears and cougars and coyotes. So what a lot of projects do now is they actually build them these kind of artificial lodges. So they've got something to move into, so they don't get eaten on their first night. And here's a beaver enjoying her new artificial lodge after being relocated. Another option for kind of beaver restoration is beaver mimicry, right? Building these beaver dam analogs, these human-built beaver dams. And again, that's really useful because, a lot of places, as I mentioned before, right, when you lose those beaver dams in a stream and the stream downcuts, it erodes really dramatically, that's a really hard place for beavers to recolonize, right? Because the stream is kind of trapped between the banks, and it's like a fire hose. It just if they try to build a dam in there, it's just going to blast it. The water's just going to blast that dam right out of there. So in those kinds of situations, it can be really helpful to build some structure, right? To kind of pound some posts into the stream bed, weave some willow branches or straw in there and just give them a little bit of a leg up, and that way you can kind of encourage them to recolonize an area they might not recolonize otherwise. And this sort of technique is being used all over the country, especially the American West, but also also in the Chesapeake Bay watershed and parts of the Southeast. This is being done a lot. And there was one really cool study that kind of illustrated the promise of this sort of technique. This is a stream system in Oregon called Bridge Creek. Where there were some beavers present, but they weren't really doing too well. So scientists, 115 of these things, of these beaver dam analogs, these artificial beaver dams. The beavers went crazy, built 120 dams of their own. They spread water out all of the floodplain, right? So the inundated area doubled as all these dams are pushing water out onto the floodplain again, and filling up all of these old side channels that used to exist but had gone dry. So beavers and humans together kind of took this single thread stream. They made it a really complex, messy, multi-threaded stream. I think that's really cool. And what they documented as a result of that was a 52% survival increase for threatened salmon in this little stream. So that's humans and beavers together kind of partnering to create really good habitat for this federally listed fish. I think that's a pretty cool success story, and it sort of shows the promise of working with these animals rather than against them. And again, here's another little beaver dam analog that we put in Eastern Washington last year. And this is kind of a cool project because this is actually all of these ponderosa pine limbs. This is all from like a fuels reduction project in a local park, right? So the local agency was just trying to reduce the fire risk, cut all this material, and then we were able to sort of repurpose that, for some stream restoration. So kind of a cool little project. So I've been talking a lot about benefits for fish and birds and other wildlife, but what about benefits for us humans? What do beavers do that we might care about? And not that that's the sole measure of why a species matters, but it is a useful argument to make. So what do these animals do that we might care about as Homo sapiens? I mean, the first fantastic thing they do is they're really good at restoring streams, right? And Chris was talking about wetland restoration, using beavers, and there are just all kinds of great case studies of that all over the country. Here's one of my favorite ones. This is in Northeast Nevada. And here you can see the stream. This is in 1980. The stream's just totally lifeless, right? It's just been, overgrazed for a century by cattle. So in this case, this is the Bureau of Land Management, the federal government, which owns this land and leases it to ranchers. And basically the government and the ranchers kind of work together in the 1990s to, put in some really basic common sense prescriptions, some fencing along the streams and changing the kind of the timing of the cattle, trying to take some of that grazing pressure off the stream a little bit. And because of that, the willows and cattail started to regrow. And in the early 2000s, the beavers showed up. Nobody reintroduced them. They just had this kind of magical way of, finding available habitat. So here's what the stream looked like in 1980. And here's what it looked like in 2017 after about 15 years or so of beaver recovery. So this is, you can just look at this and say, clearly this, this looks better than this does. And you can see all of this cattail grow at the top of an old beaver dam. I think that's pretty cool. So they're really, deeply embedded in the system. And basically what the researchers who studied this site found is that, they found 20 acres of open water, right? So beavers just creating all of these great ponds and wetlands like they do. Beavers actually added 3 miles of wetted stream length. So what does that mean? When the stream looked like this, it was so degraded that it was actually going dry before reaching its confluence with the main river, right? The water was just, evaporating or going subsurface. So by building all of those dams, beavers are just slowing water down and ensuring that there's still water in the stream, by August or September, the kind of the hot, dry season. So beavers basically took a seasonal stream and made it perennial. I think that's pretty amazing. They also raised water table 2 feet, right? So, when you look at a beaver pond, all of the surface water you see, but what you don't see is the weight of that pond forcing water into the ground and, recharging aquifers, hydrating soils, raising the water table. there have been estimates that there's, as much as 10 times, there's 10 times as much groundwater at a beaver pond than there is surface water. So there's so much groundwater being stored, and they're basically sub-irrigating huge extents, right? So beavers help to grow 100 more acres of riparian or stream-side vegetation, right? They're just incredible irrigators. So that's a big deal for this guy. This is James Rogers. He's one of the ranchers who's worked with beavers in Northeast Nevada, and what he told me is that, beavers basically increased the forage production on his ranch tenfold, right? Which means, more weight on his cows and more money in his pocket. So now there's this really wonderful kind of pro-beaver cluster of ranchers in Nevada who have seen their benefits when it comes to, drought mitigation and irrigation. It's just a cool example of beavers restoring streams and benefiting the agricultural community. Another fantastic, I think that's a little counterintuitive, right? Beavers cause floods, they don't prevent floods. But when you think about a big pulse of rainwater, racing down a stream, a big storm surge, that pulse of stormwater hits a beaver complex, and it's captured in the pond, it's sunk into the ground, it's spread out laterally, right? A huge volume of water is being stored, and they're really attenuating these potentially destructive floods. So this is a picture of a beaver complex in Scotland, of course, a very rainy place where Eurasian beavers have been reintroduced for their flood control benefits primarily. So I think that's pretty amazing to contemplate, right? As if you get these two kind of polar opposite problems, drought on one end, flooding on the other end, and beavers are helping manage both of those problems by kind of stabilizing flows. That's a really incredible thing to contemplate. Another fabulous thing that beavers do that's really relevant in the Midwest is they're great at capturing pollution, right? You've got, you've got the stream flowing downriver. It's carrying, all of these nitrates, phosphates, pesticides, heavy metals, all kinds of stuff. And then that water, that stream hits that beaver dam, it slows down, and it loses its energy, and it just drops all of those suspended solids out of the water column. All kinds of just, again, fantastic studies showing that beavers are capable of capturing and removing a huge proportion of the nitrates, especially in agricultural watersheds. And they're also great at sequestering carbon too, right? All of that carbon-rich organic matter, is settling out and being entrained in the pond bottom, and you can just see this kind of beautiful cake of organic matter that's been built up behind this beaver dam. So they're basically kind of landscape scale kidneys, removing the pollutants. And the other the really fabulous beaver benefit that we care about a lot here in the American West is they're great firefighters, right? Obviously, water doesn't burn, and beavers are spreading out water and dampening the landscape, and they're irrigating plants, right? So they're taking these brown, dry, crispy, flammable plants and making them green and moist and plump. And they're creating these wonderful fire breaks and fire refugia, where all of the animals can retreat during a wildfire and survive the fire and then repopulate the landscape. And here you can just see, this is a fire in Idaho, and all of the uplands have just been burnt to a crisp, right? There's not even like a stick left here, and this beaver-created valley bottom is just green and blue and wet and lush. I think that's just pretty incredible, and is really, no pun intended, one of the things that's made beavers really hot. Is their wildfire fighting abilities. So, given all of the fabulous things that beavers do, it's worth asking, why do we still kill so many of them? Why aren't they more embraced as restoration partners? And I think a lot of it comes down to, our lack of historical memory, historical imagination. When we killed 400 million beavers, we profoundly changed the landscape. And, I think that we internalized this notion of a healthy stream being this, free-flowing, fast-moving, single-thread, cobble-bottomed thread, when in reality, lots of systems look much more like this, right? The water was kind of spread out, it was slow-moving or barely flowing, dead and dying trees everywhere, the bottom's kind of mucky, it smells sort of funky, and this is not the sort of thing that you would see in like a fly fishing magazine, but I think that in most places, this sort of beaver-mediated aquatic system, was more rule than exception. And I think that we still have a really hard time getting back to that, or recognizing these systems as healthy, and here's just kind of one, I mean, there are a million articles like this, but just one illustrative article. Beavers returned to Staten Island recently in New York City, and all of the local residents were just going crazy. And this guy, Palladino, said, well, the stream was never a lake before. Beavers are wreaking havoc and totally transforming it. But of course, this guy wasn't here 1,000 years ago, and I think that's the issue, is that we've internalized. We've internalized unhealthy streams as normal and natural, and we view any beaver-created disruption as being unnatural, when again, these animals were just profoundly ubiquitous here at one time. So we have to reconfigure our sort of ecological imaginations to embrace what these animals do as natural and healthy. So to sum it all up, we have this fabulous animal. It provides all of these wonderful benefits and services for both us and other species. It does it all for free, and best of all, it doesn't need permits. That's really nice too. So as the mantra of the Beaver Believers go, it's time to step back and let the rodent do the work. I think that kind of captures the partnership really nicely. So with that, I'll say thank you so much again for inviting me. We've got time for some questions. I did write a book about this stuff if you're interested. And I know Chris and Kate and others posted the title, but yeah, let's take some questions.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben. That was amazing. Yeah, I have some questions that people have sent beforehand that I can begin to go through. But if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask now, go ahead, you can unmute yourself. Again, this is a conservation conversation, so feel free to turn on the microphone and ask Ben a question. Or if you want to, you can also still put it in the chat. But one question that we had was, with climate change impacting virtually every part of life, changes in hydrological regimes seem to be on the rise. What role do you think beavers can play in this changing system, and how are they being impacted?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I mean beavers play a profound role, and I should have touched upon this in the talk, but that's really the reason that there's so much interest in beavers right now, especially again in the West, but also in the Northeast. Because I mean, look, in the West, so much of our water comes from snowpack, right? Snowpack is just so important, and as the climate warms, that precipitation falls as rain rather than snow, and when it falls as rain, it just runs off the landscape right away, and it's basically lost, right? We need that that gradual melt of snowpack all throughout the summer to keep our streams full and cold. So you start to think, well, if we're losing snow, maybe there's some other way of creating thousands of little reservoirs up in the headwaters to hold water in the landscape and get that nice time release trickle. And that's exactly what beavers do, right? So they're really wonderful climate adaptation tools, and that's also true in the Northeast as well, where climate change means more and more big intense precipitation events, big rainstorms, and beavers, because of their kind of flood attenuation abilities, are really important ways of fighting that too. So again, we've got drought and flood both being exacerbated by climate change, and beavers are helping us address both of those things.
Definitely. I think I can speak on both. Chris and my part, we're both certified FFT2, so wildland firefighters and prescribed fire people. But it's so incredible the work that they do in wildland fire management and prevention. So that was one thing that I thought was incredible. But another question that we have, we got multiple of these that are all kind of related, but it's about how would you recommend talking or approaching landowners and land managers who care about their land, but they're having that conflict with beavers, and so trying to encourage them to not trap them but find a way to coexist, like how to broach, approach that subject with them. What would be that first step, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think this is I think this is sort of a cop out in some ways, because you need like the patient zero, but I just think it's so important to find ambassadors, right? So I'm not, I don't know who this person would be in Indiana, but out here in the West, I mean, there's just a few really wonderful ranchers, who have just become fantastic voices for beavers, people who have reintroduced beavers to their ranches and, just had incredible drought mitigation benefits, created water sources for their cattle, turned the stream that fed their homestead from a seasonal stream back to a perennial stream. And those people just have so much more credibility in certain communities than certainly I do as a writer, or that conservationists do. I mean, it's just like when Jay Wild, the rancher from Idaho, who one of the guys I write about in my book, when he comes in with like his thing of dip in his pocket, and wearing his cowboy hat, I mean, he just has so much credibility, and awesome webinars all over the country, and he's just a really powerful voice for these animals. So I just think it's so important to find the right ambassadors. So I don't know. Again, that's probably a cop out. I wish there was some sort of magical thing you could say, but I think like most issues, you just gotta figure out what people care about, and meet them where they are, and find the right voices in the community to advocate for the beaver cause.
Definitely. Yes. Thank you so much. We have a question from Art in the chat. Don't all these slow waters and ponds breed more mosquitoes? So issues of malaria, other insect-borne illnesses, etc.
Great question, Art. So there's only been one study of the beaver mosquito connection, and actually found that beavers profoundly decrease mosquitoes. There are many fewer mosquitoes in beaver ponds, and the reason for that is because beaver ponds they're just full of life, right? They're full of fish, amphibians, birds, animals that eat those mosquito larvae. So so I forget where that study was set, but I mean, basically what happened in that instance was the beavers sort of like sufficiently deepened the pond to support fish year round, and the fish just took care of the mosquitoes. So again, it's not something that's been extensively studied, but the evidence that we do have suggests that beavers reduce mosquitoes.
Yeah, and that's just another component of them being like an ecological keystone. It's not this direct line into like, oh, beavers immediately lead to this. There's all these other things that they introduce into the ecological equation then that are interacting and may not lead to that result that we might assume.
Yeah, it's amazing. There are amazing studies of beavers changing phytoplankton communities and ponds.
Wow.
Like one of the really amazing experiences I had a couple of years ago was I was in Vermont at a wetland, and the beavers had opened up the canopy, they'd taken this really dense hardwood forest and just created this this beautiful light-filled patch, and there was just jewelweed blooming everywhere, and all of these hummingbirds were showing up to feed on the jewelweed, right? So it's like there's never been a study of the beaver hummingbird connection, but when you view it, it's unmistakable, right? It's clearly happening. So I think that there's just this incredible wealth of biological connections that remain to be studied.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that just from a personal anecdotal point from one of our preserves, Bean Blossom Bottoms, which we talked about at the beginning, Ben. I spent a year out there working on some restoration work on our boardwalk, and whenever we were working in the areas that were near like the beaver dams and ponds and so forth, we weren't nearly bothered as much by the mosquitoes and deer fly as we were in the areas near the roads where there's just wet ditches, or in the wet woods where there was just some really stagnant pools of water. But when we were near where the beavers had been active, as you said, there were fish, there were dragonflies, everything else that kind of helped keep everything in balance. And it was remarkable. You knew when you were in a certain area, even if you weren't looking at the area, if you had your eyes closed, because you knew you were being swarmed by mosquitoes or deer fly, or you're in the other areas where there were less. I mean, it's not that there were none, but there were a lot less in those areas.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. Like when Chris and I are doing stewardship work during the summer, like my favorite place to be is the swamp, because I know that is Like when I'm working out there, I'm not going to be attacked by mosquitoes 24/7. Maybe like the walk-in and the gravel lot, yes, but once you get into that more open marshy area where the beavers have created like raised the water level, it's just a total change. It's awesome.
That's really cool. I also love, the other thing I didn't mention during the talk, but that you mentioned, Chris, in your email to me was just, the fact that these beaver dams are being used as highways by all kinds of critters, moving through the marsh. That's, another really important function is just, creating these travel corridors. And that was, certainly that was true, that was true historically for humans as well. Native people were using beaver dams as highways through these very damp areas. That's just another kind of wonderful biological connection, is the fact that they're just creating these fantastic bridges, for bobcats and deer and all kinds of critters.
Definitely, yes. Let's see. Oh, our land preservation director, Rob McCrae, has a question. So you talked about how the beaver is on the New York state flag, correct? So he was wondering. Oh yes, the city seal. So he was wondering if, do you know why the beaver is on the Oregon state flag?
Yeah, just a kind of amazing testament to how important beavers were. The Oregon flag, interestingly, it's the only state flag in the country that has two different sides. So it's like it's an asymmetrical flag. One side has a beaver on the middle. The other side, I think, has other important resources like wheat and cows and gold or something like that. But again, that was just just an amazing testament to how important beavers were. And that, one of the first white settlement in Oregon, was Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River, and that was a fur trading post. Those were Oregon's first white inhabitants. Were pelt traders. So just kind of amazing. And now it's funny. Oregon is actually, for the beaver state, Oregon is not, it's definitely lagging behind Washington and some other states in its beaver friendliness. In Oregon, beavers are actually classified kind of absurdly as predators, which means that they can be shot on sight by any landowner. So Oregon could, for the beaver state, it could be a lot better about its beaver coexistence policies.
John Lawrence, our executive director, says for people near Bloomington, there have been recent beaver activity at Jackson Creek Park. Walk the trail along the creek to see many freshly gnawed stumps.
Cool.
Yeah, you can also see a similar thing when you go out to Bean Blossom Bottoms Nature Preserve, our Sycamore property. Once you get to like the loop, where the loop begins on the boardwalk, if you look to the left, there's telltale signs of beaver activity. They've completely changed the landscape there. They've removed lots of younger red maple that were growing there, which, funnily enough, we were actually planning on maybe doing some management on to open up that area, but the beavers beat us to it. Let's see. One question that I had, you were talking about how beavers work and how they're so beneficial in capturing agricultural pollutants. So I was wondering, is this detrimental to the beavers at all, having this concentration of pollutants, especially when they're interacting so much with the organic matter, where that pollutants are then accumulating? I'm not sure if there's been any study on that whatsoever, but
yeah, there really hasn't been. So the answer is basically we don't know. One of the really nice things about certainly like the nitrogen pollution, right? The nitrates, which are such a big problem, is that all of that stuff is basically being denitrified by bacteria at the bottom of the beaver pond, right? So that all of those the nitrates in liquid form are basically being turned into nitrogen gas, which of course is most of our atmosphere, by the microbial communities in the beaver pond. So they're actually eliminating the nitrates altogether, which is pretty cool. As for some of the heavy metals and stuff, again, we don't really know. I did get a cool picture recently from a kind of the Bureau of Land Management biologist here in Colorado, who took an amazing picture of these beavers that had colonized like the mouth of an old mine shaft that had been flooded, and like, the water just was orange. It was disgusting. It was, just full of like cadmium and arsenic and, zinc and copper and all kinds of stuff. And it's like some of the most polluted water she'd sampled. And the beavers, had basically built a lodge in the mouth of this flooded mine shaft, and we're seemingly living there happily. So who really knows? Nobody studied that as far as I know. But it's a good question.
Yeah, maybe we'll know sometime. Let's see. Ooh, we had some questions. Oh, wait, hang on. Actually, this one came up in the chat. So I have heard of Keystone Species, but I was actually surprised to learn that a beaver is considered a Keystone Species. Oh, thank you for a very informative learning experience. And this is a similar question to what we were talking about earlier. So a beaver colony that used to live at a local state park, and then the management there removed them. So kind of how do we encourage land managers on like a public level that have a kind of broader reach than a singular like private landowner, from like discouraging them from doing that? It's a much broader reach that they have.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to identify the potential conflicts that they're concerned about, and then find ways of mitigating those conflicts, right? So maybe they're worried about trail flooding. Okay, great. That we can put in a beaver deceiver, a float ice. Just figure out. I mean, there's this very reflexive sort of knee jerk. Oh no, the beavers are here. They're gonna do something bad. But usually figure out what people's concerns are in a concrete way. You can usually address those concerns, right? And there's a great I'll put it in the chat. But there's a great nonprofit called the Beaver Institute, which is run by a guy named Mike Callahan in Massachusetts, and and the Beaver Institute website, which is just beaverinstitute.org, has all kinds of sort of explainers and resources for like, here's how you install one of these float devices, here's like the best way to the best gauge of wire to use to protect your trees, that sort of thing. They're just very concrete tips for dealing with these potential conflicts. And I think that often when you just when you just drill down to, okay, what are the specific conflicts you're worried about, there are ways of solving those conflicts, especially at a place like a state park, which doesn't have presumably not a ton of infrastructure to protect. That feels like a place where conflicts can be easily solved.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's hard trying to think of how to broach that subject on like that kind of higher policy level. But those are wonderful resources. Thank you so much. Let's see. Here's something that I was very curious about. What led you to beavers specifically? I mean, you have an upcoming book about road ecology that I would love for you to talk a little bit more about, but what brought you to the beaver?
Yeah, they just came to me in a dream one night. No, I don't. Yeah, I grew up in New York, and I spent a lot of time in the Catskills and the Adirondacks. New York has all of this really wonderful sort of wild lands, which a lot of people don't know about. And upstate New York is like one of the most beavery places in the country. So I was always around them growing up. Hiking and camping and fishing. I've got lots of early memories of hearing a tail slap on the water while canoeing at night, as a child with my parents. So I was always had an affinity for beavers. Always liked them a lot. But then it wasn't until I guess it was in 2013 I moved to Seattle. I was living in Seattle and working as a journalist, just looking for things to write about, stories to cover. I somehow caught wind of this beaver workshop that was going on in a Seattle suburb. I was like, well, I don't know what a beaver workshop is, but I know that sounds like a story to me. So I went to this beaver workshop, and it was just unbelievable. It was just it was just all of these different scientists, ecologists and fish biologists and wildfire people and, geomorphologists, all talking about why beavers were so important for their piece of the ecosystem, and it was just mind blowing. It was like, wow, this animal that, I sort of grew up with and always thought was, was cute and fun, isn't just cute and fun. It's actually, this keystone species and this ecological engineer, and really one of the most important agents of restoration in North America. So it just, it was sort of like, wow, this is a huge story. And that was what got me going, was that workshop.
That's great. Let's see. This is, kind of related. But how did you get into writing, and specifically like the science communication part of it? Because whether it was Beavers or your upcoming work, what drew you into that certain field?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I certainly always loved to write. As an undergraduate in college, I was a creative writing major, so I wrote fiction primarily, but also always loved nature and and wildlife and conservation. And after college, I had a kind of series of field ecology tech jobs, working for the National Park Service in Yellowstone and the New York City Parks Department, doing urban forestry and tagging sea turtles in North Carolina, just kind of like living like the itinerant ecology tech life. And then I went to grad school. I got a master's in environmental management. Sort of thinking like maybe I'll go for a land trust. I mean, that was really honestly my kind of my plan, was just be engaged in the day-to-day work of protecting acreage. But it was then in grad school that I sort of remembered that I loved to write, and I found myself sort of writing for various campus publications and newspapers and whatnot. And it's just like, at the end of the day, I think that I enjoy the writing more than anything else, and that was kind of what got me going in the world of journalism.
Yeah, I love hearing people's stories about what led them to their certain career path, because it is just never just the straight and narrow road, especially in like the ecological or just like science community. People are going all over the place.
Yeah. A lot of non-linear career paths for sure.
Definitely. We have a few more questions in the chat. So Indiana is full of narrow creeks. How wide a channel does a beaver need?
Yeah, that's kind of the beauty of beavers. They don't need much, right? They expand the width of the channel. I mean, you see them in these really insignificant little trickles. I don't know if there's I don't know what the number is, but I mean, I've just always been amazed by like the tiny, pathetic little thread of water that they are capable of turning into an enormous pond. So I'm not sure what the sort of like the bankful width of the minimum bankful width of a beaver stream is, but it's nothing. If there's flowing water, they're gonna find a way to make it work.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And that's what happened at one of our properties in the Bean Blossom Bottom area, where it was just the tiniest little trickle that went from this wet field into Bean Blossom Creek. And we had one heavy rain and the beavers came and changed the entire landscape. Yes, it's incredible thing to witness. Let's see. Jeff and Legine White are asking, what about all the trees taken down by beavers? Are there disadvantages to that aspect of beaver behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on. I mean, certainly, in an urban context, you might want to protect those trees, and kind of redirect the beavers. But I think that in a sort of a wildland context, I mean, there's, that felling trees is actually a wonderful behavior, right? Again, you've got, I mean, especially in eastern hardwood forests, you've got these really kind of dense stands, and that's oftentimes kind of lightless on the forest floor. And by felling trees and opening up that canopy, beavers are just creating these wonderful light-filled patches on the landscape. There really aren't many forces of disturbance like that, especially given how much we've suppressed wildfire, right? So it's, so felling trees in a wetland context is actually a really beneficial behavior, in a lot of ways. And also, I mean, beavers kill a lot of standing trees too, right? They flood an area, and a lot of trees end up dying, and those those dead trees end up being really good nesting habitat for all kinds of woodpeckers, raptors, golden eyes, cavity nesters. So I think that we have this sort of, understandably, we have this protective attitude toward trees. We want to plant more of them, but felling and killing trees, that dead tree, dead trees are just another form of habitat.
Definitely, yes. Another question from Jeff and Jean. So they asked, are the monsoonal rain patterns and resultant hydrologic shocks with climate change a looming challenge for beavers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, certainly you could imagine that these really intense flow events would blow some dams out. I mean, beavers don't. I guess it's possible that that occasionally in a really huge event maybe they would drown, but from a kind of like a dam stability standpoint, it's definitely possible that it could be more challenging for beavers moving forward. I haven't
Yeah, wonderful. The chat is just absolutely full of praise for you and this talk, Ben. So thank you again so much. Let's see, I think we only have time for a couple more questions, but I would love if Ben, if you want to talk at all about upcoming work of yours, give maybe an intro to the road ecology work that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. And thanks for asking about that. Yes, my next book is about the ecology of roads, which is basically how roads influence nature and what we can do to kind of make them lie more lightly on the land. So that's all kinds of things. I mean, certainly, I'm sure many of you have seen pictures of wildlife over and underpasses that allow animals to move across roads without being killed. That's a big part of the book. The decommissioning and destruction of old logging roads, which are really big sources of sediment into streams. That's the chapter about that. More culverts. The importance of sort of aquatic connectivity and the ways in which badly made culverts disrupt the movement of fishes. Just a million and one ways in which roads impact nature, and and just trying to figure out how to arrive at solutions for some of those impacts. That's what the book is really about. And actually, I'm not sure, I don't know Indiana geography at all, but are you guys near the Snake Road at all? Have you heard of the Snake Road?
I have not.
I'm almost sure this is in Indiana. Okay, I'm looking this up really quick, but I'm pretty sure there's this famous
Nate would know.
I don't know, maybe I'm no, sorry, it's in Illinois. I'm sorry that I got my Midwestern confused. But there's a road
in the Shawnee National Forest.
Okay, which is a road that's lots of snakes cross annually on their way back to their hibernacula in some limestone cliffs. And that road is closed seasonally every year, and that sort of thing is increasingly common. So yeah, just trying to figure out ways to make our infrastructure lie lighter on the land, and and it's been a kind of a longer and more arduous process. Beavers are a great topic because they touch on so many things, but at the end of the day, they're just one rodent, right? There's there's a nice perimeter to the project. Whereas a book about roads, you could go as far back as Romans and as far forward as self-driving cars if you wanted to. So just trying to figure out what not to include has been challenging, and it's in many ways I think a longer and messier book, but it's also a really rich topic. And yeah, there's no publication date yet, but I'm hopeful that it'll be out sometime next year in 2023.
Yeah, awesome. So once everyone here has read Eager, then they know what the next book of yours that they're going to go to. Fantastic.
Hope so.
Yeah, all right. So I have one more question since we're running a bit low on time, and I want the last question. I'm going to end it Ologies podcast, Ali Ward style. So what is your favorite and your least favorite thing about this work, or you're working in this field, whether that's science communication, environmental management, ecology, beavers?
That's a nice question, Ellen, to end on. Thanks. I mean, certainly, my favorite thing is just the ability to have an impact, right? And you guys are doing that. Of course, you're conserving land. What could be more noble than that? And for me as a writer, I think that I've been really fortunate, I think, to have written a that has produced some tangible impacts. That feels really good. I've heard so many stories about, like various state fish and game biologists reading the book, and changing their beaver policies, and and like town councils, using beaver deceivers instead of trapping because somebody on the board read the book, or like I gave a talk in Utah a couple of years ago, and after the talk, a rancher came up to me, like this old crusty old guy, and was like, "Hey, I read your book and I stopped killing beavers on my ranch, and I bought copies for all my buddies, and they stopped killing beavers." And I was like, "Wow, that's just amazing to know that there are animals alive and and wetlands created thanks to your work." And and you don't always feel that way as a writer, because you often don't know who's reading it and what impact it's having, and it can be kind of lonely for that reason. And that's probably one of the when you ask like what's your least favorite thing about the work, is that it is kind of lonely, right? At the end of the day, you're just kind of like one, I'm self-employed. I don't have coworkers or colleagues or a lot of people to bounce ideas off of. And that's been one of the great blessings as well of this book, is that it's be in touch with so many beaver people around the country, many of whom have become such good friends, and that's been really wonderful, and then as I give talks and do like my beaver evangelizing thing, I meet still more people, and now I know that if I'm ever in Indiana, I'm going to go to Bean Blossom and hang out with you guys, so that's just been incredibly rewarding. It's just becoming part of this larger network and community of people who care so much about this animal.
Well, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about it and teaching us about it. This has been absolutely wonderful. And so from everyone on the Sycamore staff and everyone who came here tonight in the Sycamore community, thank you all so much. I don't know if Chris, if you have any last words, or Ben.
Just a big thanks, Ben, and we'll make you an honorary co-worker with us, so you feel a part of the team. And you've definitely converted, I think, a lot of people here tonight, if they weren't already converted. You definitely have a lot of Beaver believers here, and all thanks to your book. And whenever I meet someone, I like to talk about, what are you reading right now? And I always ask, have you read? And a majority of the people I've asked have read your book, and everyone that has is always like, it's great, you have to read it. And the people that are with us sometimes that aren't, I was out banding owls last fall, and we were talking about it with somebody, and they had read it, and then everybody else was like, what are you talking about? And we're all like, you got to read it. So we are spreading the word, and so you should feel the love coming from Indiana, and you can check that state off your list now of spreading the word about the beavers. So we really appreciate it, and it's been great to meet you virtually. Hopefully someday you come to Indiana, we'll give you the grand tour of our properties, and happy to show you around. So
I would love that. I'd love that so much. And thanks for all you guys are doing for my favorite critter, and thanks for all you're doing for the planet at large. It's your work is so appreciated.
Thanks, Ben. And thanks everyone. And again, if you want to be a part of the next conservation conversation, it will be May 12th with Nate from the DNR. And until then, stay posted to see what else we've got going on at Sycamore Land Trust. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.